Welcome to this recording of the Activist Lawyer podcast, brought to you from the Grainne podcast studio in the heart of Newry City. We are delighted that you could join us at Activist Lawyer, where we will be discussing a range of topical matters engaging not only with lawyers, but people who are committed to highlighting and combating injustices and inequalities. We will bring you our thoughts, but invite you to share yours. We'll be looking for contributors to our blog at activistlawyer.com, as we want your perspective as we unravel and unpack a host of issues. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm a solicitor practising in Newry City. I worked with a human rights firm in Dublin for many years and with a number of rights-based organisations and charities. I'm looking forward to meeting some fantastic guests throughout this series. Hello listeners, we're here with Jessica in our studio today.
Hi everyone.
In the Grainne podcast studio here in Newry, and happy to be here. We have a fantastic episode for you today. You will hear the recording with Grainne Teggart from Amnesty International. And Grainne really goes through a lot of her work. We could talk about it all day, but we focused in on some issues that are really, really topical at the moment, both in the media and especially here in Northern Ireland around abortion law. And we hope to have Grainne back in again to revisit that, because it is something that's progressing quite rapidly, I guess, at the moment, or maybe not. We'll see how things develop around that. We also discuss violence against women on the back of the recent murder of Sarah Ewart by police in the UK and what's come out of that. So quite topical issues there. We hope that you enjoy today's podcast. And again, let us know your thoughts.
And like and subscribe. We'd appreciate it if you could leave us a review as well. That would be great.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Grainne Teggart is Campaigns Manager in Northern Ireland for Amnesty International UK, where she manages campaigns including public affairs, media and strategic litigation across a range of issues, including human rights in the UK, women's rights and legacy of the past. Grainne led Amnesty's intervention in the Hooded Men case, which will reach the UK Supreme Court later this year, and is currently working with Michael O'Hare, brother of Majella O'Hare, who was a 12-year-old girl shot dead by a British soldier in the 1970s. She is supporting the family in their campaign for an independent investigation. Grainne leads Amnesty's campaign for abortion rights in Northern Ireland and played a key role in challenging the law through the courts, working closely with those impacted by the law, such as Sarah Ewart, and advocating for change at Westminster, which culminated in the UK Parliament legislating for abortion law reform. The new laws took effect on October the 22nd, 2019. Grainne is a regular media contributor on this and many other human rights issues. Outside of Amnesty, Grainne is a serving director of both the Integrated Education Fund and Informing Choices NI. So thank you very much, Grainne, for joining us today and taking time out of your busy routine. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Okay, so just that's a very impressive repertoire that we've just gone through in terms of your involvement in so many different matters in Northern Ireland and in human rights and your other work that you do as well as that. So, but just for our listeners, some insight into your journey as the campaigns manager or two campaigns manager with Amnesty International in Northern Ireland would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I've been with Amnesty for over a decade now, 12 years, since 2009, and was during that time I've worked on, so many issues ranging from the local to international. Mm-hmm. So issues like an arms trade treaty, human trafficking, violence against women, sex work, also then legacy of the past in Northern Ireland, and more recently abortion rights. Mm-hmm. Now, prior to joining Amnesty, I worked on issues such as disability rights. So it was the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that was around the time when we were lobbying the UK government to ratify that treaty. At the time, the UK government were trying to enter 44 reservations to that treaty, and through collective working with other organisations and international lobbying focus, we were able to get those down to 4. And also then I spent some time in the social economy sector and integrated education. I'm now currently, as you've mentioned, a director of the Integrated Education Fund, but I did also previously work for the Council for Integrated Education. And I suppose for me, I've always been someone who's been very political, very interested and engaged in the political process and how that impacts on our everyday lives. So for me, there was only ever one sort of clear direction I was going to go in terms of working in a job that offered me that interface to, you know, affect change in people's everyday lives. And I know that sounds, you know, a bit cliche to say, but, you know, my view of power of authority was always to challenge it. And, you know, no better organisation, obviously, than working for Amnesty. So, absolutely. I mean, because I'm conscious that obviously some students, you know, listen to the podcast as well. I mean, my career route in terms of university was like a degree in politics at Queen's University and then a master's in the University of Ulster in communication, advertising and PR. And that sort of brought together, if you like, the various disciplines that, you know, that I use in everyday terms. And I would recommend, you know, to any students, as well as, you know, the courses that are of relevance, that paid internships are definitely a way to go to get some of that practical experience as well. I mean, I gave up a paid job to actually take at the time an unpaid internship in public affairs in the private sector, because I knew that I needed that experience. So I think that is helpful for students to consider.
Absolutely, great advice. And also, we've had lawyers on this show, on Activist Lawyer on the podcast, who covered various issues, and we've had political commentators as well. But you've been involved in many of those cases that we've spoken about, or at least Amnesty itself has. So obviously, as we follow the development of judicial reviews, appeals to the High Court, Supreme Court on a range of matters, including one prominent issue that you just mentioned there about abortion, you seem to be very much involved. How do you work along with lawyers? How do you push cases forward? And how do you provide support to, I suppose, victims and those seeking access to justice?
Yeah, I mean, I do think strategic litigation does have a critical role to play when we're trying to bring about change in our society. I do see it as just one tool sort of in your campaign's, you know, repertoire, and it's, you know, unfortunately and increasingly it is needed, because what we have is a government reluctant to move on issues such as abortion that it should have long since addressed. So, you know, if we consider the abortion rights campaign, you know, just for a moment, I mean, I was very happy to play my part in overturning what was a near 160-year-old abortion ban. I mean, the North had one of the strictest laws globally. It had the harshest criminal penalties in Europe, and there were very significant barriers to accessing that healthcare. I mean, prosecutions were a reality. We saw the mother who was being hauled through the courts for accessing abortion pills for her then 15-year-old daughter. And there was a very obvious and cruel injustice there, given that, you know, had she been living in another part of the UK, she would have been able to access those services free, you know, on the NHS. They were freely available. So it was very much a case of, you know, this wasn't on the agenda when I started this work of the political institutions, you know, in these islands, and we had to force it onto the agenda. And a key way of doing that was through the courts. It was about challenging the rights abuses that were arising from the law, because our politicians for too long had been turning a blind eye and were happy to ignore the cruel reality of living under this abortion ban. So it was working with you know, lawyers, firms like Phoenix Law, but also, and crucially, with women who were being directly impacted by the law. So women like Sarah Yurt, and obviously we joined the Human Rights Commission case and fought that the whole way up to the Supreme Court. And I have to say, you know, in that particular case, it was so vital that the courts had evidence in front of them. Yes, obviously we made the legal arguments around the, you know, the human rights violations, but also they needed to understand what it's like to be a woman in Northern Ireland, needing access to this healthcare and not being able, you know, to get it. So in Sarah's case, obviously, it's a very well-known case, but her fetus had been given a fatal diagnosis. And we fought the whole way up to the Supreme Court. We brought in the evidence of other women as well, including a woman, Denise Phelan, who actually, her case was interesting because arguably she qualified under our existing law for an abortion, but because of the climate of fear around our laws, no one would sign her off. So in Denise's case, she ended up delivering a decomposed fetus, you know, and I know that's a bit hard for, you know, listeners to hear, and I appreciate that, but that was what our law meant. So in parallel, it was very much a strategy of, we're fighting this through the courts whilst we fight this through our political institutions. And ironically, when our devolved institutions collapsed, it actually offered us then an opportunity, because the first thing, you know, I did was get on a plane to Westminster and start growing that cross-party constituency of support for change. And obviously we know how that went with Westminster eventually changing our law.
And it was picked up by, I remember Stella Creasy giving a fantastic commentary piece on it. And it's really about drawing attention there. And as you said, you've just referenced two people there, but it's really bringing those real lived experiences to the fore to get people speaking about it and understanding the cruelty that was in place in Northern Ireland at the time. Yeah. Now, we haven't seen full change. We'll get to that in a moment, just to bring us up to speed to where we are. But as you said, it was very divisive. There was a lot of, and still is, political point scoring around this issue. But Northern Ireland was declared to be in breach of human rights law.
It was.
I think on 2 occasions as well. And the Supreme Court deemed it incompatible, the laws here incompatible with human rights, despite the fact that one of the cases brought, I think it was by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, there was an issue just around, the type of case that was their standing, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, if I can just mention just about the Supreme Court just for a moment, because it was really interesting, and I think it certainly for those listening who are interested in human rights law and moving into that area, I mean, it was quite unprecedented, the judgment that the Supreme Court gave, because what happened was it was found that the Human Rights Commission didn't have standing to take the case, which we obviously disagreed with, but basically because they were saying they weren't a victim themselves, but because they had evidence of victims in front of them, they then proceeded to obviously give a judgment and say, but for that standing point, we would have obviously found the Article 8 points. It was interesting because Article 3 in terms of torture, they did, one of the opinions did say that some of the evidence in front of them would constitute torture, and I do think that was Denise that they had in mind when those comments were made. So on the day the Supreme Court judgment was handed down, Sarah Uritt and I, because obviously it was a joint, we were working jointly with our legal team, which obviously included, Phoenix and Monya Danes was our barrister. We walked outside to the Waiting Media and declared that we had submitted papers to Belfast High Court and that we were bringing the fight right back to Belfast High Court with Sarah then, obviously as the victim, as the named person. So I think that was really crucial, because what we wanted to signal was that this isn't over, that we will continue with us until obviously we get there. And thankfully, by the time Sarah's judgment was handed down, the change had come, at Westminster, but it was very much a strategy that required the litigation with moving the public with us as well. There was a lot of public attitudes that had to be changed. We know Northern Ireland is a pro-choice population, but we had to obviously change and challenge some of the harmful myths and stereotypes.
So Grainne, that being said, where are we now in Northern Ireland? Are we moving forward at all with this? So
where we are now is, having overturned the abortion ban, and also now being the only part of these islands where abortion is decriminalised. So it's treated as the healthcare matter that it is, and not a criminal justice matter. The health minister refused to commission the services. He brought a paper to the executive last year in April around proposals to do with COVID, around telemedicine, which is effectively taking the pills at home, abortion pills at home for early medical abortions. And, in spectacularly bizarre fashion, he actually abstained on his own proposals, and they were then blocked by the DUP. So where we now are is that we don't have commissioned services, which means we have, if you like, I sort of term it a postcode lottery for access to the services. We have seen some of the early medical abortion services collapse and then obviously be reinstated, because our health minister has left it to the health trusts and organisations like Informing Choices NI to try and create some pathways to this healthcare. But, this is never, and should never have actually been, an executive matter, because it's not like other issues that are deemed to be controversial in inverted commas, because the law is the law. It has already changed. So what we actually should have had was the health minister just getting on with commissioning. Sinn Féin are bringing proposals to the executive this week around the commissioning of services. And on one hand, yes, obviously setting aside the executive point I've just made, that's welcome.
So Grainne, if all else fails with our politicians and our political parties here in Northern Ireland, what happens next? Where are we going?
If that fails, if the DUP continue to block, which is potentially what we expect there, the Northern Ireland office, Westminster, has to finish the job that it started here, and the Secretary of State has powers that he can exercise to direct the department here to actually then commission the services. So we're engaging and we're pushing obviously for the Northern Ireland office to move on that, because they can't just wash their hands now and say job done. It isn't. They have to follow this through to the end, and either way, that's where we will get. If it doesn't get through the executive, then I do think Westminster will finish this by way of directing the commissioning of services. The Human Rights Commission have obviously also taken a case.
Yeah.
Again, it's welcome, but I think it would be a crying shame in this instance, if that got to here and if that proceeded and that our politicians, failed us and let us down by not commissioning the services themselves and taking that initiative.
But Grainne, does that mean that during this time women have still been travelling outside of Northern Ireland to seek abortions?
Well, COVID has obviously complicated everything because obviously women simply can't travel. So what we have seen is that, a lot of women are making use of the early medical abortion service. That only applies up to 10 weeks. Legally, it should be up to 12 weeks, but that's what can be facilitated in the trust at the minute. Outside of that, the access varies by trust. So some women are able to access services and a lot aren't, which is why we so desperately need that commission. Very, very few are travelling now. Some have had to, and some have had to take, for example, the boat, to Liverpool. And that's like a 2-day round trip, in a pandemic. So at a time when we know the obvious dangers in terms of, interacting with other people, etc., because of COVID, we have been forcing women obviously still to travel for healthcare that they're entitled to here at home. But my hope is that if our executive fail, I hope one obviously that they don't, that they actually commission the services. But if that fails, then the Northern Ireland office has to now act with urgency, because we can't have a situation where during a pandemic we're expecting women to travel.
Yeah. So you've mentioned there, we've touched on litigation, we've mentioned the role of the Northern Ireland office, the executive, and of course Westminster finishing this job. However, you did also touch on public views, I suppose, on all of this and public perception. What is that? I mean, I worked in the South leading up to the Repeal the 8th campaign, and we were very involved in roundtable discussions. There were experts, including doctors. There were huge panels of people who would go out and speak to the public, again, trying to shift opinion. I know it's a different setup there around the Constitution and having to actually put a referendum in place. It was the people who voted, and we're slightly different here in Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, I do see almost every week in Newry, where we're based here, protests outside of one of the local healthcare providers with the images that so many of us have seen. They're so offensive and traumatic, and the signs and people standing there for hours throughout the day. How do you change public's perception? Because I think a lot of the political parties have a stance, and even within the parties themselves there's a lot of division. But how do we bring the public on board, or does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a key part of, the campaigning around this. I mean, what we have, I would describe them as like a very vocal anti-choice minority, but they are absolutely the minority. And I think, certainly when I was started this work, all those years ago, I was very mindful that these weren't conversations that were happening in the mainstream, media as well, and that it would be needed by way of shifting the debate and also putting a spotlight on just what the situation was, because I think for a lot of people, they were just unaware of the very real harm that was being caused. But I do want to pay tribute to so many of the grassroots activists, who would take, like Alliance for Choice, for example, who were taking the stalls in Belfast City Centre, on a Saturday and promoting through other ways, those grassroots, conversations, because that absolutely played a critical role, also. But I think, for me, and obviously being the spokesperson for Amnesty on this, we done things like obviously research on what the public opinion was, through the opinion polls, and it was always coming back that at least 7 in 10 supported change here, and that included the decriminalisation of abortion. So when we had these arguments made that, Westminster are, imposing this on us, well, one, devolution never relieved Westminster of their responsibilities to women here anyway, and two, it very clearly wasn't, because the public here wanted change. And you're right when you mention about, repeal the 8th, because that was such a seismic shift, on the island. It was a huge victory for women's rights, and for everybody who obviously worked on that campaign. I mean, it's been such a long time obviously coming, but that obviously did then highlight the fact that we were then completely isolated, that the North was isolated as on these islands as the only part with an abortion ban, and that obviously did help momentum as well. But that again was happening in conjunction, and at the same time that legal challenges were being taken, that the public discourse here was happening. It's so many activists here pushing, you know, in the south obviously as well, because a win there is a win for women here, and there was very much, you know, that understanding. And you know,
the north is next seemed to be the first thing that people turned to. That was the next, you know, the next campaign that everybody had to support. But seismic changes happening through organisations like yourselves, like you, obviously the lawyers who are pushing this forward, and of course you mentioned their Alliance for Choice, and there are some others as well who have just been on the ball and completely proactive throughout this and deserve great credit for especially as well dispelling myths, you know, that without that type of campaign, people are listening to dangerous information and information that is simply not true. So I think it's about spinning all plates at the same time, and hopefully we'll get there. But as you said, there's no option either. There's one way or another we'll get there, because the law is the law. So just moving on a little bit from abortion, you've been involved in so many issues. We covered a few of them there in the introduction. What's next, or what stands out in the agenda aside from that? As if you don't have your hands full already, but
I mean, I work on other issues, you know, like torture, you know, all the night, you know, all the light ones, you know, so torture, dealing with the legacy of the past.
Sure.
You know, here I'm very fortunate that I work with, you know, some amazing people who, you know, decades after they've either lost a loved one through the troubles here or experienced obviously violations themselves, that they're having to fight, and again through the courts, you know, to have their rights realised. Because if we take like the legacy of the past, you know, for example, what we've seen is the British government, there were proposals around the Stormont House Agreement. It was the first sort of time that we had a degree of cross-party consensus on the way forward. Obviously, the Julian Smith and Simon Coveney, you know, the New Decade New Approach Agreement, and that was January. And then in March, we saw the British government then renege on that agreement, and they started then push back on the Stormont House Agreement, you know, the mechanisms, which actually was giving us our map, you know, our way forward, you know, for this. It was the combination of truth and justice that, you know, victims obviously have been so long overdue, and they regrettably they reneged on that again. It was no coincidence that came at the same time as the overseas bill, which was looking at, you know, effectively giving an amnesty for soldiers overseas, you know, in those operations. So it was very much a coordinated, concerted effort by the British government around, you know, victims not accessing their rights. So that's why so many, including those that I work with, are fighting through the courts. So there's a particular case at the minute, you know, it's not at the court, you know, yet, and we'll have to see, you know, if that's where it has to head. But like Michael O'Hare, who's, you know, sister Majella O'Hare, she was, you know, 12 years old when she was shot in the back by a British soldier. And, you know, again, all these decades later, still no justice, you know, for that family. I mean, I think it was 2011, you know, the Ministry of Defence did apologise, you know, for Majella's killing. But then to do that, to apologise and not then follow that through with justice, it's just, I think obviously the apology rings hollow, you know, for the family. And we're supporting Michael now in trying to get an independent investigation into, you know, Majella's killing. If we're talking about, you know, activism, you know, families are activists, you know, because victims are activists because they have had to be, because they have been failed by government, because they have been blocked and obstructed by government at every turn, trying to get that truth and justice. And, you know, ultimately what our work, all of our work is about, your work, my work, is about the accountability of power, you know, of government. And without that activism in every sense of the word, then, you know, rights abuses would continue, that, you know, they'd go unchecked. You know, Amnesty, you know, as an organisation, we are just a movement of ordinary people, you know, who are fighting for change, and, you know, hopefully through our work, giving a voice to people who are oppressed.
Yeah, it's so important to have that strategy in place, because especially now, given that it seems like we're facing an era, a post-Brexit era, where that work there's an attempt to silence it, and an attempt certainly to silence lawyers and to quell and curb various mechanisms that we would use. For example, the government has recently they've talked about it for some time now, but it's on the agenda again, about repealing parts of the Human Rights Act, pledging to update the Act and administrative law, and just, I mean, their excuses to ensure there's this balance between the rights of individuals individuals, national security and effective government. So the way they're marketing it, it's all very, very positive. But they keep focusing on, and I suppose lawyers again counteracting that, on the mechanism of judicial review, for example, which is just one way, of protecting the rights and, as you just said, access to justice as well for individuals against the state. But there seems to be this effort here to just quell that, and there's talk about it. Maybe it's just on a superficial level, but that's very worrying, Grainne. I mean, it's something that you've been supporting through your work, whether it's supporting a lawyer, the victims' access and justice. Again, you've mentioned the example just there of Michael O'Hare. I mean, without these, it's becoming quite sinister, in my opinion, and quite worrying. How do we ensure that this doesn't happen, and how do we keep these issues on the agenda and, pull together to stop this, because it's not acceptable. Even the discussion about it is worrying.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that you've said. We are working in the Human Rights Act as, one of the other issues, obviously, that I work on in terms of protecting that, because it has been so critical in cases like the abortion one and so many others, as we know. But undoubtedly, there is a very hostile political environment that we're operating in at the minute, and we have a government that is unashamedly breaking the law, and in parallel to that, very deliberately demonising those like yourself and ourselves who ensure and work to ensure that it's upheld. We've seen obviously from like the Home Office, very dehumanising, language that is used, even in public communications like tweets, etc. And to further policies that obviously have very grave consequences for, well, in that case, refugees and asylum seekers, but it's all to deflect from what is a very concerted campaign to erode our rights, to remove safeguards that we have all obviously had, but that we all need, that we to depend on. This is not a government that likes being held accountable. It doesn't like challenge, and they are very quickly introducing laws and policies that will curb any prospect of this if they succeed. So you're right, we all should be very deeply concerned. If we consider the Human Rights Act at the minute, that is one of our critical ways of holding the powerful to account. And obviously the fact that there are those attacks on that, it is about government ultimately placing themselves above the law. If we, this is at the heart of our democracy, being able to challenge government, so when we restrict that access to justice, effectively the outworkings of that is the powerful will dodge any sort of accountability. It obviously undermines completely the rule of law. And in a very sort of Northern Ireland specific, context, if we consider the Human Rights Act, any weakening obviously of those protections will be in breach of the Good Friday Agreement, and obviously will lead to an undermining of the successful elements of our hard-won peace process, although obviously it's a work in progress.
No, to politicise any of this is just dangerous. But yeah, we'll watch as matters continue, but I think they do face huge opposition to any of those suggestions. Something really that strikes me, and it's something that I know that your work has touched on as well, not touched on, but been very much involved in. I myself have worked on the issue of tackling violence against women and girls previously, but Northern Ireland does not have a strategy to tackle violence against women and girls. We saw the death of Sarah Everard, who was murdered while making her way home. So there's a huge outcry on social media about this. At the time of recording, a police officer had been arrested. And then there was huge criticism against the police for how they handled a peaceful vigil following the event. And they made multiple arrests, and that's still ongoing, the investigation into that. So Sarah's death itself, obviously, they're saying abduction is very unusual, but in fact, violence against women and actually murdering women in this country is not an unusual occurrence. Indeed, far from it. There's been incidents of extreme violence reported every week. Some of the organisations like Women's Aid and other organisations have highlighted the statistics around it, which are very shocking. But people have taken back the Reclaim the Night hashtag, which was used many, many times before. So this issue itself, I'm sure you've been following it as well, Grainne. How do we ensure, just based on what we've just said there around the government, how do we ensure that matters like this, like a violence against women strategy, remain on the agenda? And how important is it for activists and campaigners like yourselves to hold them to account to ensure this happens? Because it's really knee deep in discussion now and debate around it, which is something that's fundamental really for the protection of women and girls to feel safe to even go outside their homes.
The Sarah case, obviously, that you've mentioned, and what we have seen, obviously, through COVID is a very worrying trend of how protests are being policed. For example, the Black Lives Matter protests, obviously closer to home, here, and the police ombudsman obviously found that the PSNI did act in an unfair and discriminatory manner, that it didn't do anything other than pay mere lip service to human rights, and that I think it was the PSNI's use of the Serious Crime Act, against what were peaceful protesters was entirely disproportionate. And it goes back to the point that, we were discussing about, this eroding of our rights, of our freedoms, because the police obviously failed to uphold people's right to freedom of expression, protest, peaceful assembly, and it discriminated against ultimately anti-racism campaigners. But, I think in the context of, violence against women, I mean, it is another pandemic, it is an issue that we are slowly getting to grips with, as a society, and there obviously have been some moves through bills, obviously, that Naomi Long, for example, has brought forward as Justice Minister. But we do have a long way to go, and we are the only part, again, of the UK that doesn't have a violence against women strategy, and that will have to come, and it will have to come and address violence in all its manifestations, and also what we understand those to be, and obviously how they come about. So how we keep that on the agenda is, we mobilise. What we can't have are situations where women cannot walk the streets and obviously be safe, or get home obviously safe, and that there's some immediate outrage, in the aftermath of that, and then nothing happens. People have to obviously come together, concentrate their efforts on pushing our politicians to ensure that women here are afforded every protection that they're entitled to, and a strategy a properly well-resourced strategy will be one way that's addressed. But it also has to tackle societal attitudes, because Twitter, if you like, can be a hard place, for women as well, like the violence against women online, as well, and how that very quickly translates to offline, violence as well, and the response that you see to cases like, Sarah's. It tells us just how much we have to do to challenge, the attitude amongst men, because again, there's no point in us, sort of speaking to an echo chamber here, and there's no point in us speaking to, like ourselves and preaching to the converted. What we have to do is get into the heart of the conversations where we're actually challenging, and part of that will have to come through the media by way of getting into people's living rooms, how we understand all of these issues. But I mean, who of us haven't, sent a friend a text, to say, let me know that you get home safe, we've, carried keys between our fingers, we've thought twice about, am I safe walking back to, the car park absolutely here, do I need someone to accompany me back to my car? I mean, if that is where we are in 2021, we have a long way to go.
A long way to go, and it's so normal to act like that and behave like that. We all do. It takes a story like this to really make you think about what's happened to yourself. And what I remember, even when I lived in Italy years ago, tucking my hair up under my hat walking home from work to make it look more boyish, walking along the, everybody has something that they do, and it becomes the norm. It's normalised that we do that. But I think you're right. And I think, if I'm not wrong, there is some pressure there on the executive here, and I think they have responded to say that they will show a commitment to continuing this work around a strategy, and fantastic organisations like Women's Aid and
absolutely.
This I suppose it's so that, I mean, people like Sarah, women like Sarah, haven't died in vain, that something is done, and it's not just lip service. So it's putting that pressure, keeping it on, and I mean, this really, really highlights the issue. So, but
also I think it is a point about like the urgency, that all of this is dealt with, as well. So, it is great, and obviously it's welcome when we see commitments made, by our politicians, but it's, beyond those commitments, it's, it is the nitty-gritty of how quickly can we get the strategy here, what will it look like, will it take proper account, of all the issues, and what conversations need to be had publicly, and the role of our politicians in that, as well as obviously activists, organisations like Women's Aid and ourselves, to push that on. So I really hope that our executive do deal with this issue with the speed that is appropriate.
Absolutely, and that it's led by experts, and that it's something that can be relied on as well, that it's pushed through and it is treated as a matter of urgency. But of course, we've victims and so many people that can feed into this, and organisations like Amnesty and everybody else involved. But again, just another example of a matter to really tackle going forward. But Yeah, so Grainne, thank you so much for coming on today. We really hope to have you back because there's a lot there that we need to revisit, I think, in the coming months.
Yes. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come on and talk about some of these issues.
Not at all. It has been our pleasure. And thanks again to all of our listeners. It's really fantastic to have you join us here at Activist Lawyer. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram for more updates and more events that are coming your way.
This podcast was recorded in Grainne Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Grainne Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.grainepodcaststudio.com.